Good morning, Cathaoirligh, and you're welcome, Minister, to the Chamber. And many of the comments I'll be making, I suppose, will be a repeat of what I've already said in relation to the microfinance bill and obviously the private members we had last week in relation to workers' rights. But I suppose just to start to say, the Labour Party will be supporting this bill, and we appreciate the necessity for it, and we appreciate where the Minister is coming from in bringing the bill to the House. And other comments that have been made by previous speakers we would agree with, particularly in terms of the lifting of the portfolio cap. I suppose, Minister, in your contribution, you've made placed a heavy emphasis on the July stimulus package, and I suppose what we would say to that is that we released our own July stimulus proposals there last week, and there's a number of tests that we would have for every piece of legislation that comes across the floor of any house in this Oireachtas, in trying to deal with the massive impact that COVID-19 has had on our country and on our economy. You will appreciate that the economy has fallen off a cliff, and in many respects it's very different to what happened 10 years ago, in that there will still be a capacity issue regardless of how much we can reopen and how much people are able to spend again. There are many small and medium-sized enterprises which will have a capacity issue in terms of how many customers they can cater for. There's a reality also that, as you know, it is easier to retain a job than to create a job. And so in everything that we try to do in terms of microfinancing or credit guarantees, we're trying to maintain jobs that already exist in the economy, and that's obviously extremely important. So what we are suggesting to you that all measures that we take have to be big enough to counteract the impact of COVID-19, but also with Brexit. And in many instances, I wonder if members in this House or people in the country are as cognizant of the impact of Brexit as they are of COVID-19. COVID-19 is something that we're living with, we're thinking about. It's creating a huge sort of mental health barrier on the entire country. But if it hadn't arrived, if we weren't talking about COVID-19, we would absolutely be talking today about Brexit and the impact of Brexit and the actions of the UK government in that respect, because the potential of job losses in border counties and the south east of the country is huge in the case of a no-deal Brexit. The impact on jobs, businesses, household finances would be huge. Now, we have recommended a package of about 10 billion. If reports are to be believed, your government is suggesting a package of 7 billion. There's obviously a gap in between those two measurements, but the massive hole in the public finances has to be bridged somewhere, and that's why we feel that any stimulus or any piece of legislation or any initiative has to be big and bold in order to recognise the magnitude of what we're dealing with. And the stimulus must be directed at creation of good quality jobs, especially for younger workers. Now, we feel that there needs to be conditionality with a lot of these measures, in fact all of these measures. And I recognise what the previous speaker said in relation to workers' rights, that you can't. It has to be based on legislation, it has to be based on trade union recognition, it can't just be based on quid pro quos, and I accept that. At the same time, it is important that we don't return to the old economic model. The old economic model fails so many people, and I'll keep using these statistics as long as I have a platform to speak about them. The 23% of Irish workers in low pay, the 40% of young people in insecure work. And that wasn't working for so many young people, and we understand now that 45% of young people are now unemployed. We've one of the highest youth unemployment rates in Europe, and that's something that has to be recognised when dealing with a stimulus package, when dealing with legislation, when dealing with measures that reenact and build up the economy again. We need good quality jobs that will last and not insecure, because if insecure employment, as we know, leads to insecure accommodation, leads to insecurities and a whole lot of life choices. So we need to have a new economic model based on lifelong learning, on caring, on sustainability. And all of these measures must be aimed at reducing economic inequality. And that has to be an overarching aim. As happens in a crisis, you make crisis measures and you don't think long term. And this is the fear that many of us have, is that while we will support this piece of legislation, that a lot of pieces of legislation or a lot of stimulus packages or announcements are made in the white heat of a crisis. And we appreciate that, and governments have to respond. But there are massive long-term impacts to the short-term measures that are taken or the big bang announcements that are made. And if whatever announcement is made adds to economic inequality, well then it has to be resisted and has to be rethought. And none of us on this side of the chamber are trying to be difficult. None of us on this side of the chamber are trying to not help in whatever way we can to get the country out of the difficulty we find ourselves in. But we can't then return to what I've already described as an unfair and unequal economic model, which is based on low pay, based on low tax and based on low pay. And it's not something that we should stand over. And within all this, we shouldn't be shy, Minister, about demanding to strengthen our public services. Now, many of your businesses that you speak of, and I know it's many business leaders will speak about the challenges they have with rents and rates, etc., and that's all very understandable. But when making pronouncements about rates, cutting them or rates holidays, that they are vital funding streams to local authorities. And I'm not in any way suggesting that there shouldn't be movement on rates. There absolutely should, and there has been, and that is welcome. But that money needs to be replaced because local councils depend on them. And you may suggest that local councils are over-dependent on ratepayers and the business community, and that might be an arguable comment. But at the same time, that funding needs to be replaced because public services need to be continue to move. We need to be able to provide public housing. We need to be able to still fund our parks, our playgrounds, our libraries. The council services that everybody depend on so much. So while we're trying to depend on trying to reboot the economy and trying to ensure that businesses can survive, at the same time, it'll be challenging for local councils to survive if the rates that they're used to obtaining from business in order to fund these services are no longer available. So they are the 5 tests that we have for you, Minister, in terms of the July stimulus. Big enough to make an impact, so we've suggested 10 billion. Create good quality jobs for young workers because, as I said, 45% of them are unemployed, and a huge portion of them were in insecure work before the crash, the COVID crash, if you like, based on a new economic model which is for decent jobs and secure jobs, reduce economic inequality and to obviously improve public services. So within all that, Minister, the Labour Party will be supporting this bill. We have a strong track record on producing pieces of legislation that can be practical and can work. But we will constantly make the point to you, and indeed the Senior Minister, when he takes these pieces of legislation with you, is that we are incredibly critical and have a very long-standing critique of any model, economic model, which lets employers away with exploiting people, or lets a government or an economy away of building a recovery on the backs of those who can't stand up for themselves. And it is disproportionately younger people, it is disproportionately women, and it's disproportionately migrants who are the ones who are in these low-paid, insecure jobs. And these, of course, are disproportionately affected by the rental issue. So all these issues overlap, they all are interconnected. And also, disproportionately, the people that I speak of don't have access to mainstream media, don't tend to have access to powerful lobby groups that can speak on their behalf. And indeed, if they do happen to join a union, the union has a veto. The thing about industrial relations in Ireland is that it's like, I believe it's been described as joining a golf club. You can join the golf club, but you don't necessarily get to play. And that's the reality of the volunteerist model of industrial relations in Ireland, which I think we'll be challenging over the next number of years in order to ensure that workers have a chance to recover as the economy recovers. So, Minister, within all that, we want to see business recover, we want to see enterprises survive, we want to see an Ireland that can get out of these dark days. We completely understand that many businesses were only beginning to turn the corner after the last crash, or only beginning to believe in themselves again, only perhaps beginning to take on somebody else to employ again, was perhaps building an extension or maybe opening up a new outlet. And so we completely understand that many people have been devastated, not just by the COVID collapse of the economy, but also the fact that the dreams they had up until Christmas have now been destroyed, and many of them feel they may not open again. And so with that, we want to absolutely support the bill and what you're trying to achieve, but we cannot, and we will be consistent on this, we cannot say that if we go back to where we were before Christmas, that everything is fine, because it isn't, because a huge number of people are suffering in desperate conditions, and these are people who are working, and that's what's so disappointing when you hear statistics that come out in terms of the level of unemployment being down and full employment in the country. It's a type for employment. It's the desperation in which people can live within these employment figures that are clouded by the figures. So, Minister, they are my comments on the bill. We will be supporting or not opposing the bill, and look forward to engaging with you as it passes through both houses of the Oireachtas.